in Atlanta. Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to our guest, Alex Gonzalez.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Can you hear me? Am I on? Okay, very good. Perfect. Well, good afternoon. Hopefully, I'm getting you out of studying for an exam or something. So this is great to be here today. I talk about Georgia Tech all the time. I mentioned about Scheller as one of the secret weapons, I think, in the Georgia Tech arsenal. So for those of you who are in the business program here, it's fantastic. And of course, it's just a great institution. It's one of the key assets that makes us innovative here in the region. So thanks for the great introduction. I do come from a heavy corporate experience of companies like Equifax here locally and GE and Chubb. And, you know, I like to tell people that I had corporate ADD. I kind of got tired of my jobs all the time, and I was kind of that disruptor within, which you kind of need in big organizations to drive innovation as well too, and spend some time, following my passion recently, which is helping advise major executives understand how to be disruptive within themselves and within their companies. And then, of course, the other passion of mine is Atlanta. And just last year, I joined the Metro Atlanta Chamber, which, by the way, I never thought in my life I would ever be working for a chamber. Didn't even know what it was, and probably still don't even know what they do. But I know what I do within it, and actually I do want to know what we do. We are here to create an incredible business climate, and there's a belief we have in terms of we can make this the top innovation hub in the world. And we'll talk about what that means for us as well, too. So today, I know we have 30 minutes roughly about, so I could talk to you, and I'm told that there's a lot of Q&A here. By the way, first of all, how many of you are undergrads? Great. And so how many of you are grad students? Oh, pretty good. So we'll see who has a better question. I'll remember who you are. But we're going to, for today, there's kind of three things, and then we'll take it for wherever you want. So hopefully you'll learn about, I'm going to talk about 6 things that kind of is important to create an innovative ecosystem. These are attributes that you can apply whether you're talking about a company, a nonprofit, whether it's a region or a city like us. And so you're going to see me tell that story through the lens of Atlanta and why I believe it's an innovative ecosystem and why we're uniquely positioned. But really those lessons you can apply to anything. Along that journey too, I might talk about people. And at the end, if we have time, I'm going to sneak in some of the attributes, because during my introduction, we talked about this disruptor studio. So I spend a lot of time studying what makes innovators innovators. So we might talk a little bit about innovators' DNA, and what are some of the common traits that I see when I interview these leaders. And the third thing is, for those of you, how many of you are from Atlanta, or you're from the Atlanta area? I know that's a tricky question. All right, so there might even be an excuse for you to want to stay, as you see here, why this is a thriving place for you to stay after you finish your studies at Tech. So let's kind of get on here. Obviously, feel free to, I like to blog and write about innovation all the time, so feel free to follow me whenever you'd like. And the first question is always going to be, what is innovation? And please, as I tell my kids, ignore what I'm telling you when it comes to whatever your test is going to be. So whatever your professor says, come to your exam, feel free to use that response. But this is a question that comes all the time, and there is not one answer. I'm sure there's some textbook answer someplace, and this dictionary has a certain meaning for it. But it is tricky, because if you talk to an entrepreneur in the startup ecosystem, if you talk to someone in a corporation, if you talk to an artist, if you talk to someone in the music industry, it means something a little different. For me, it's about being very broad, and it is about things like dreaming, being able to dream and make those dreams a reality. And you say, well, that seems kind of soft, isn't it? But that's where innovation starts. It's that collision of many things that come together. So the ability to dream and be aspirational and believe what you're going to do, but more important, at making it real, because innovation is nothing without execution, right? Ideas without execution is just ideas. That's what innovation is about. So when you think about an organization, when you think about a region, a city, how do you make that real? How do we become a destination in terms of a region where the doers, the entrepreneurs, the corporate executives that want to be able to dream big and solve some of the biggest problems in their industry, biggest problems in the world, that they could come here and make those dreams a reality? That's how we think about architecting an innovation ecosystem. So let's start. So there's 6 attributes that we talk about. And first of all, it is about diverse perspectives. How many of you have been to an Atlanta United match? All right, very good. Now, for those of you who have ever seen me talk before, I am just obsessed with Atlanta United. It's one of my favorite things. Very fortunate to be here at the ground floor of this club. But if you've been to a match, there's something just incredible about it. And it's not about the energy and the passion, and yes, that is pretty special. but it's about when you look around the stadium, it is Atlanta. It's extremely diverse, from ethnic to race to gender to ITP, OTP, to what schools people go. You see every aspect of Atlanta at Atlanta United. And it really is a reflection, and Darren Eales, who's the president of Atlanta United, was one of my first guests in the Disruptor Studio, and he talks about wanting to create a club that really showed how united Atlanta is and really bring out the diversity of it. So it's something that everybody kind of attached to. So what does it have to do for innovation? So let me kind of bring you into an example. Let's say you're starting up a company, and you're an entrepreneur, or maybe you're in a corporation, and you have a team that's supposed to think of something big and new. So this is one of the greatest institutions in the world here at Georgia Tech. But if you put yourself with a project team that have 5 people from Georgia Tech around graduating at the same time, do you think you're going to have the best, most diverse ideas? Absolutely not. Absolutely not, because diversity does a couple things. It brings, first of all, different experiences to the table. It also brings collisions and sometimes tensions, because your experiences create different perspectives. And innovation needs that tension, needs different perspectives, needs different walks of life to thrive and live. So when you think about a company, it's one of the things when I walk in there, one of my biggest concerns is when I see teams that look very similar trying to solve big problems. Or if I go to entrepreneurial centers, I see a bunch of people who are taking birds to work and are trying to solve problems around consumer issues and have never commuted, or don't have anybody on their teams who've commuted. It seems simple, but you don't really understand how the world is operating. So diverse perspectives, and here in Atlanta, incredible diversity. In fact, so much so from a chamber perspective, there is a problem on the entrepreneurism, and we could spend an hour just talking about this, where less than 10%, and in some, depending on which category, it's less than 5% of venture-backed entrepreneurs are Black, Hispanic, or women, any one of those categories. So if you think about venture capitalists, it's kind of the same stats. But we believe here in Atlanta, which by the way, we're maybe a little bit better, but really not that much better. We think we could solve some of the world's biggest problems by changing those dynamics, by embracing the diversity that we have here. So that's one attribute of the diversity. The other thing here in Atlanta and in this region is we have incredible diverse industries. When people say, hey, what's the big industries in Atlanta? I talk about everything from logistics to fintech to restaurants. Think about Chick-fil-A and Focus Brands and all these other companies being based here, to esports. We're one of the rising capitals of esports. So we have companies like Cox Enterprises, one of the biggest companies in the country, who's investing in teams like the Atlanta Reign, to Skillshot and Hi-Res Studios up in Alpharetta, Georgia, that has 400 employees. Half of them pretty much went to Georgia Tech. The other half went to SCAD, designing games for this huge industry that's thriving. Those collisions of industries help create new innovation. Because imagine if you're here in Atlanta, one day you could be working for Chick-fil-A, then you could be working for Hi-Res, and you could be working for Honey Baked Ham, then working for Equifax. There's a lot of pretty cool perspectives you bring through that. So diversity is an essential part of innovation. And of course, with that comes creative DNA. And creativity means a lot of things. There's definitely the artistic aspect of being creative. And the other is just about being able to push boundaries. I'm naturally a nonlinear thinker. So in the corporations I make sure that I work with, I make sure that I bring that nonlinearity into the environment. And you think about Atlanta as a region, we have so much richness. You know, we are the hip-hop capital of the world. So of course, we talk about our movie studios, we talk about that aspect, but we also have this incredibly thriving digital agency system here in Atlanta. Companies here like on the Beltline, there's this building called the Willoughby with companies like Stable Army, Dragon Army, and Dagger. These are companies that are hiring a blend of technical folks, computer science folks, UX designers, marketers, all blending, all coming together to creatively solve some of the biggest brands' problems and be able to help market, for the rest of the world. That's part of the creative DNA we have here. And that's part of the creative DNA that companies need to have as well. And of course, creating space and environment to be able to think, reflect, connect, and all that. What a great place in Atlanta. And be able to get a different perspective. There's a reason why, beyond tax credits, the movies like The Shoot here, it's like one moment you could be in a place that looks like downtown, like Manhattan. The next moment you could be in an open field where zombies are walking for Walking Dead. And so those different perspectives are different stimulus for the brain, and that's how you think. And whenever I work for corporations, we take them out of the environments so they could create those creative juices, so they could create connections they may have not had before, so having that space. So creative DNA is definitely the other part. And then customer obsession. Talked about diversity before and the importance of having that. Part of it is have real world life experiences. One thing that I love about Atlanta is we have a lot of very customer obsessed companies. So if you think about Chick-fil-A, do you think they're a food company, a chicken company? If you talk to Dan Cathy, he'll talk about they're in the customer experience business. And don't get me wrong, he'll say I'm a chicken salesman. He loves to say that, and so do their executives. But we look at their innovation center down just south of the airport, where they have simulations of their stores, and they have a huge digital screen of everything happening on their apps, and they recreate what it's like to get through drive-through. They are in the customer experience business. And same thing with Delta. And that's Ed Bastian on your right there, the CEO of Delta, who's constantly talking about innovation now. And in their innovation lab right down the road here at the hangar, that's what their obsession is. When I talked to their CIO, Rahul Samant, at South by Southwest a few years back, I said, what's your biggest problem? I thought he was going to be talking about technology stacks and all these really technical things that a CIO worries about. He said, number one thing is customer experience. And so if you think about the companies, it doesn't matter if you're in airlines or chicken, or if you are a Cabbage, one of the fastest growing fintech companies in the world, or MailChimp, who's redefining kind of marketing for small businesses, the common denominator is being customer obsessed, redesigning their processes, redesigning products from the customer's perspective. And I like to actually say, what's our biggest industry? I tend to actually say a lot of time it's customer experience. So somewhat industry agnostic, but really focused in terms of a trait that all the businesses drive for. And of course, those first three things, being customer-centered and being creative and diversity, creates the fuel for idea generation. Then you got to get stuff done. And this is where this tension comes in innovation. And we could talk about this as well, too. Some people say, I wish I had no constraints. But the reality is there are constraints in the world, and sometimes constraints create the potential for innovation. So capability to do is you have to have the mechanisms to be able to execute on your innovation. And that's what sometimes kills companies, whether it be startups or corporations. As a region, what I love about here in Atlanta is we have a lot of capability to do. We have 38 corporate innovation centers. Many of them, about 20 some of them, within walking distance of us right here. Most of them in the building, the Synergy building, the Accenture building just down the road. That's how corporations are colliding. Their engineers, their marketers, students from Georgia Tech, the corporate community together to get stuff done. Because corporations are really good at delivering results, particularly because they have those quarterly accountability. So they're looking, so that's a great thing for Atlanta, this heritage of all these Fortune 500 companies here. They know how to do stuff. So that's a real cool thing we have as a region, that we have that strength of the companies. But even beyond the corporate innovation centers, we do have a lot of great startup infrastructure. So things like the Atlanta Tech Village, Tech Square Labs across the street, ATDC down the road, the Russell Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, which is actually going to be probably the largest incubator for Black entrepreneurs in the country. These are capabilities where people are coming together to figure out how do we now help. We have great corporate infrastructure. How do we now help our entrepreneurs make sure they get stuff done with mentoring and lawyers and accountants and everything that comes to run a business? Because without that, it's just an idea. So you need to have the capabilities to do that. And of course, by the way, we have almost 300,000 college students in the metro Atlanta area. That's great capability. That's talent, what you are doing. And of course, I'm sure I always show Georgia Tech no matter what school I'm talking to, so don't worry about that. And I'm especially at UGA, right? But yeah, the talent and the ability, and it's also just the talent, the diversity of the talent. The Scheller here, the amazing different disciplines here at Georgia Tech that's solving some of the world's biggest problems. But they start thinking about the spectrum. You have SCAD in terms of what they're doing. Georgia State, what they're doing with the media studies and their and virtual reality. There's so much going on for preparing our talent, our next-gen talent. We just had a huge event yesterday at the Metro Atlanta Chamber talking about next-gen, because we want to be this next-gen region, and it starts with you, with next-gen talent that could dream and make those dreams come to life. So that's a big part of our capability here in our region. And of course, all of that I mentioned before about collisions or impact, or things coming together to collide and make stuff happen. if anybody says that you go into a room by yourself, you ever worked at a company that say just go off, and you have free reign to innovate, and we'll see you in a year, you're in trouble. Tension and conflict is important. At some point, you got to collide. What you develop from an engineering perspective has to collide with market realities. Collisions are essential for innovation no matter what. And you think about from a regional perspective, I think that's what really helps us get stuff done as well, too. Let me use a sports analogy. The reason why we're constantly winning these big sporting events here is there's this selfless perspective that our business leaders have to make sure we get the Super Bowls and the NCAA championships and so forth. Putting ego aside, colliding in terms of what the tensions are to be able to get stuff done. In terms of the innovation ecosystem, I'll give you a real-life example of the guy on the left. His name is Mark Gorlin. He is a co-founder of Cabbage, which I mentioned before, one of the unicorns here we have in Atlanta, one of the fastest-growing fintech companies that gives loans to small businesses. One of the biggest companies and the fastest growing fintech companies in the country. And he's currently also founder and CEO of a company called Roadie, which basically is crowdsourcing shipping. So if you get your Roadie app, he'd be happy if I told you to download the app, because you could be a Roadie driver, or you could ship through Roadie. Is if you want to say you have a friend up over in Dallas, Texas, and you need to get something to them, you just go up the Roadie app, and it matches up a driver that's going to Dallas anyway to ship that product. And so what's amazing about Mark is not just the innovation around what Roadie does, is his intense collaboration. So if you think about what I just talked about, what do you think is one of the biggest competitors in Atlanta for Roadie? Who should be threatened as a corporation? UPS, one of our biggest companies, one of the biggest companies in the world. They're one of the first investors in Roadie. Mark was able to talk to them, and of course, this is also a testament to UPS's innovative perspective, investing in emerging technologies, and they are a major investor in UPS. Mark went on. He also figured out a way with Delta solving one of their biggest problems, because in the very, very unlikely chance that Delta may accidentally, inadvertently, and unlikely lose your bag. We love Delta. But if that happens, don't you hate it if it takes you 8, 10, 12 hours to get it back? And I just mentioned they're a very customer experience obsessed company right now. Well, Mark was able to go in and collaborate with them. And now, in Atlanta and some other markets, if your bag happens to get lost, the person who's going to take it to you later is going to be Roadie. Cutting the experience, the amount of time for delivery significantly. That wasn't easy, because startups always talk about it's really hard to work with big corporations, but Mark figured it out. And further, and just recently, he got a big investment for Home Depot, so they could help in terms of delivering products from Home Depot, because we're in this on-demand economy right now, right? Everything's on your app, it gets delivered to your home. So again, he figured it out. In addition, got an investment from Home Depot. And then, of course, you see him at Waffle House. He has partnered with Waffle House, where Waffle House is a meetup space. So if you want to ship something, you can meet up at Waffle House. So he likes to sling waffles while he's there doing it as well, too. And by the way, one of his spokespeople and early investors is Ludacris, which I know for you, you're like, God, he's so old. But for my age, he seems really cool, but that's okay. But Ludacris, I went through that with my kids, and they're like looking at me like, oh yeah, that'll go over with the old corporate group's dad, but that's about it. But Ludacris, but that's an example of colliding our hip hop culture also with this company. So that is this intense collaboration. And Mark's a special person, by the way. When we talk about innovators' DNA, we'll get to that in a second. But that's innovation in action. You got great ideas, but you got to get stuff done. None of it was easy, but those collisions make some great innovations and so forth. And then on the right there is Engage Ventures, where we have our biggest companies, about a dozen of them, that have invested in a venture capital fund that now goes out and invests in startups. Again, that's a collision of kind of very different things that normally don't work together, big companies and startups, but we're seeing it here in Atlanta, how it's coming together. And there's no other entity like Engage Ventures, who's based just a block from here around the country. But bottom line, it comes back to talent. Inspired talent, inspiring talent. And this is a lot of my passion around Disruptive Studios, talking to different leaders who are inspiring, folks like Ben Chestnut, who you probably, if you don't know Ben, he is the CEO of MailChimp. Ben and MailChimp is really revolutionizing marketing for small businesses. So much, and they do things very differently. And if you have a chance, definitely look up MailChimp. They've been getting some coverage on some of the national publications, very fast-growing, bootstrap company, completely funded by Ben and his partner. But his ethos is that it's about the small business, and they even created a movie studio within MailChimp to create stories about their own customers. And it's also about culture. He actually invested in a chief culture officer that really curates a culture that's unique for their employees. So that's kind of about the inspiring talent, or people like Kat Cole. Who's heard of Kat Cole? If you haven't, I absolutely would advise, make sure you follow her. I spent some time with her in about 10 months ago, Disruptive Studio. Incredibly inspiring person, very Atlanta, loves the region. But what's fantastic about her is she works she is the Chief Operating Officer and President of Focus Brands. So think of Schlotzsky's, Moe's, Carvel, Cinnabon. All those companies are all under one company that's private equity owned. So you would think, oh, she's this conservative corporate executive. But she is also incredibly active in terms of her social causes, incredibly active in inspiring others, incredibly active in terms of driving entrepreneurism and inclusive innovation. That's inspiring talent. Or folks like the gentleman on your right, including Ryan Wilson, the CEO of a place called The Gathering Spot, which is kind of reinventing how clubs operate. And also on the far right, Paul Judge, one of the most successful. Who's heard of Paul Judge? Good, because he has a PhD from Georgia Tech, so make sure you know about Paul Judd. Morehouse grad, PhD from Georgia Tech, serial entrepreneur, one of the most successful entrepreneurs we have here in Atlanta, and keeps investing in our own ecosystem, so much so that he believes in everything we just talked about for innovation, those collisions and diversity and all those elements. He's putting his money to work in it. In fact, he and Ryan just invested in A3C, which is one of the largest hip-hop conferences in the world, or in the country at least, because he wants to make it kind of like our South by Southwest. So it's going to be a conference that collides music and tech and creative, and all those come in together to have bigger conversations. That's inspiring talent. And I will tell you, as we talk about the formula here, without inspiring talent, everything else we talked about does not matter, because you have to be inspired, because innovation is hard work. On Friday, after a week as an innovator, I tell them, if you're not exhausted, you've not done anything. If it's easy, you're not innovating. Innovation should be hard. If you have the greatest idea and everybody's just nodding for it, there's something, talk about passive-aggressive behavior. It's a killer of innovation, because you're going to invest a ton of money, and then it's going to fail. You always need some level of friction. So going back real quick, kind of this is those 6 things we talked about for the formula for any innovative ecosystem, whether it be a company or a region like we are. It's, diverse perspective, creative DNA, customer obsession, capability to do, intense collaboration, and inspired or inspiring talent. And then one thing I just want to leave you on before we open up for questions, I talk about the DNA of an innovator. This is actually part of a normal spiel, and I'll go back to the other slide if anybody wants to see those. But those inspiring talent, these are kind of some traits that we tend to see all the time. And when I talk to them, people like Paul and Kat and Darren Eales and Ford Fry, who's an incredible restaurateur and innovative guy who has incredible restaurants around town, they have these kind of traits that are pretty consistent. They're great evangelists and storytellers, because you got to be able to inspire people to follow you. And so you could have the best idea, but if you can't talk about it, if you don't know how to move people with it, if you're not like Mark Gorlin, who always talks about that his inspiration for Roadie was he couldn't get shower towels delivered to his house that he was trying to upgrade his bathroom. That's how he starts it, and you connect with Mark, and you can see why people want to give him money, because he's able to tell these incredible stories. He's a great evangelist of what he does. You have to embrace conflict. If you are conflict averse, innovation may not be your thing. Business could be tough in general too, by the way, so let me just kind of do it, because business at the end of the day is about innovation, right? But you need to embrace conflict, not picking fights for the sake of picking fights, but you need to embrace conflict for being able to get to the right end result. You got to be confusion tolerant. It drives my wife crazy because, I'm very comfortable with unresolved things, but ultimately they have to come through. But you have to understand that the immediate answer is not always the right answer. Good business sense. As I tell folks, you could have great ideas, but if it does not make economic sense at some point, it's just kind of a neat idea. And of course, infectious passion, as I mentioned before, because you are going to have tough days. You're going to have people saying, I don't want to give you money. You're going to have people, I don't believe in your idea. You're going to have people who are protecting their turf. And you got to have the passion to be able to kind of go beyond that. So anyways, those are the kind of I didn't mean to throw two frameworks at you, but figured from where you're at, those could be kind of two different interesting perspectives. But so having a great framework to create an innovation ecosystem, and then of course having the DNA of an innovator, it's a fun time to be, I'd tell you, in Atlanta. It's a fun time to be in a lot of our companies in Atlanta, because most of them are doing just that, whether it's NCR down the road, whether it's Chick-fil-A, whether it's the startups that are, by the way, not just making money, but creating social impact within the region. It's a great time. And so I look forward to answering any questions.
Thank you so much. So I'm Sally. I'll be over here on this side. Tori's going to be on that side of the room. If you have a question, raise your hand and wait until we give you the mic, just so that everyone can hear you. So who has a question? Don't be shy. Okay.
Thanks for coming.
No problem. Thank you.
Atlanta area lags a number of areas around the country in terms of venture capital.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we're not even close to some of the big venture capital centers
Yep.
around the U.S. I was just wondering, does the chamber see it as being their responsibility to attract more venture capitals, or being pretty much left up to the ideas of the local entrepreneurs, where the good ideas will bring in the venture money? I guess my question is does the chamber have any responsibility or see as part of their charter to try to get more venture capital into the city?
Yeah, the way I would answer that is we feel we have a responsibility to make sure that we have a strong business environment, and obviously having the right capital for all of our businesses, whether it's startup to venture-backed companies, PE-backed companies, of course public, to be able to thrive is important. So yeah, we absolutely look at that. I think we get somewhere between $700 and $800 million of venture capital each year pumped into the ecosystem. I am less concerned whether we're number 1, 2, or 3, right? To me, it's about can we get the right money at the right time. So if you're an entrepreneur in Atlanta and you have an idea and you have a company that has a good run rate, you're going to get money. I mean, if you think about companies like Calendly and a few of the others I mentioned, like Cabbage, they have no problem getting money. To me, the bigger thing to solve is about when you are an early stage entrepreneur, and maybe you don't have the networks. We talked about inclusive innovation, or in that early stage where you may need that initial $50,000, maybe that initial $1 million. I think we need to get more of that capital. So I don't know if that makes us number 1 or 2 or 3, but I know that's more focused. That's one. And the second thing is, and we've been looking more on capital. I think there's more need to have more venture capital controlled out of Atlanta. So we roughly 3% of venture capital that's issued, in the country comes to Georgia, but we control only like 0.3% of it. And one thing we know about money is power. Money gets drawn. So what happens in certain economic centers, people go there to get money, which kind of creates this kind of trickle effect in the ecosystem. So for me, short answer, absolutely yes. We're looking at venture capital as an important part of our broader equation. I think the answer is about, how is the capital used, what type of capital, and how much capital could we have that's unique to Atlanta. That's what we're looking at. Yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you.
So just from listening to you and getting a vibe of like how you are, you seem very San Francisco-ish.
Wow.
I just spent the summer in San Francisco, and I fell in love with the world of product. And so it got me thinking. You talk about talent. Long story short, the reason why I would say I'm rarely considering staying in Atlanta and going to San Francisco is because I believe that Atlanta isn't there in terms of products yet.
Right.
Services, they're great. You can definitely instill a great customer experience in it. Features, not things that people would pay for. They pay for the actual product itself.
Yeah.
So really, I just love your thoughts on, talent like myself wanting to leave Atlanta because we feel like it's not ready for product, which is really where a lot of the VC money comes in.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So you mentioned your San Francisco, because I'm not. I love San Francisco, visiting San Francisco, but it's interesting. One of the things when people say, hey, Atlanta could be the Silicon Valley of the East, I'm like, no, we want the Valley to be the Atlanta of the West. And part of that is because we kind of want to redefine what an innovation hub is, right? So look, the Valley is a unique phenomenon, but there's certain attributes in Atlanta that's different from them. Our corporate footprint, now granted, if you think about the Valley now, Twitter and Facebook and all that are big corporates now, but 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they were not. So we have this footprint that's very different from the Valley or different from other parts of the country. So for us right now, it's how do we architect an ecosystem that's unique and embraces those elements of probably higher level creativity, higher level of service-driven industries, higher level of experiential. Also leveraging the fact that we don't talk about enough, the amount of patent and sort of research being done at institutions like Tech and Emory is pretty significant. We don't really talk about it that much. So there's a lot more activity than I think most people think, and I'll give you some real data. This is all pretty fresh. We just had a series of dinners that we hosted with about 100 different leaders from across Metro Atlanta. We had 8 of them. We called it Project Plato. The whole idea is getting multi-generational leaders. So people from the CEOs of our biggest companies like Marty Flanagan at Invesco, to some of our up and rising entrepreneurs like Jasmine Crow and Joel Burks, names from Gooder, and folks from Capital or studio lead, people who are heads of the creative industries. And we asked them, how do we lead Atlanta going forward? How do we make us a next-gen Atlanta? One of the biggest things that came up consistently, so in these dinners, and also with the 150 interviews we did with Accenture with another group of folks, is we don't do a good job telling our story. Because there's people like you who thinks, hey, man, you're not, because there's a lot more people that talk like me in Atlanta, and I think we'll have a much more inclusive perspective in terms of what innovation could be than probably some other parts of the country. And so we just have to do a better job telling our story. I'm not saying that's the only thing. What I'm saying is I think there's probably more to it when you look at the companies. Like BlackRock just moved here they're hiring 1,000 people here in Atlanta in their innovation hub. Everything from engineers to marketers to liberal arts majors, because they feel they could get better talent here in Atlanta that's more reflective of how the U.S. is going to look. So we need to do a bit of job telling our story. So again, I'm sure if that answers your question, but I think there's a lot more of it than you believe, and that's part of our job right now, is to get that story out and keep attracting companies to do it. But I'll give you an example, again, not a product, but ThyssenKrupp, the big elevator company, they have a big innovation center, I think up in Marietta or something, where they actually test all the elevators you ride around the country, they test them here first. They have engineers who work on elevators here, and Norfolk Southern with locomotives, and then I won't even get into the whole startups, but there's a lot going on, and that's why I'm kind of in this role, because I'm passionate that we're not telling our story enough. Thank you.
Got a question over here.
Hi. Thanks for coming. So I really liked what you said about not having innovation without friction, but you described the Chamber of Commerce's job to kind of create a more, kind of pave the way for innovation to happen. So how do you kind of...
But how do we do that?
Yeah.
So of creating some friction and creating collisions. I mean, the biggest thing I could do and we could do from a chamber's perspective is right now, so let me kind of step back. There's kind of 2 things that I think we have an opportunity for us. One is what we just talked about here. There's a lot more happening than I think people even realize. And I don't know if it's about our kind of Southern culture and not bragging. I don't know what it is. But, man, we need to put, if you talk to David Cummings, who's another big entrepreneur here, he's like, we need to put freaking billboards all over the place talking about entrepreneurs and what's happening, because people just don't know and people need to believe. So that's one. But the second thing is we do have some very healthy ecosystems that are growing up next to each other. So we have a strong startup ecosystem growing up. And then even within the startup ecosystem, you have like what's happening in Alpharetta with Tech Alpharetta, and you have what's happening in Midtown, you have what's happening in different pockets. You have an incredibly strong corporate ecosystem. You have education. You have, we mentioned about creative. The collision of those is important because this is an example with the multiplier effects. 1 + 1 will equal, 5,000. And so a lot of what we do is making sure that these leaders from these different entities cross-pollinate. You know, the making sure that we collide together to create, and I say friction because sometimes what's good for the creative industry might be different for the startup industry, and how do we collide those together to make it going forward? And from those sometimes even come initiatives that people might want to work together. So for instance, whether you're in the creative industries or in the tech industry or in the corporate industry, the number one thing people are like, we need more talent, and we need more UX talent. You know, we hear a lot of our companies talking about user experience. And so things that we do is like, you know, how do we get the presidents of the universities, like President Cabrera and all the other presidents, with our corporations together to help solve that problem and create that pipeline. So those collisions, those is how we create, hopefully, the friction to make us more innovative. Or
There's a question right down there.
So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Bouncing off that question, I really did like what you said about colliding to get stuff done. However, it did strike me as a bit counterintuitive.
Yeah.
A lot of times you would think that this tension would almost derail a company
It can.
and create a really negative culture. So how can companies take advantage of it, really?
yeah,
Could you
and
elaborate on that?
yeah, no, that's a great question, and this is where. You know, of course, it's very different for different companies. And what I will tell you, that whole collision thing on startups is probably less likely because startups is very linear, right? There's a great idea, and we just got to execute to it. In a big company, one thing I've worked on with companies before, and roles I've had before as well, is you do need a group, whether it's your strategy group or innovation group, that plays that role, right? What's the right amount of friction that we got to create to make sure we're not just stuck in an almost very obvious orbit that, you know, and you've seen, I'm sure you've studied many case studies of these companies that didn't see the obvious. Because companies are big corporations, are big machines, and Wall Street is a pretty influential, you know, behavior pattern. And look, I've sat in front of, you know, Wall Street analysts, and you know, it's very unforgiving, that quarterly routine you're in. There has to be mechanisms and spaces and rooms that force companies to within their own process to get out of their way, but that can't be all-consuming. So you can't send a company into chaos. So that curation of having the talent that's able to do that, and it looks very different from different companies, whether it's a chief innovation officer in their team, strategy officer, or sometimes it's marketing, is essential. I worry when a company doesn't have anybody thinking that way. I remember having a forum with a bunch of chief strategy officers, and this one strategy officer, you know, he made a comment. He said, our strategy group is getting paid, is the only group in the company getting paid to think forward, because everybody is stuck in how do I deliver today, which is important. You got to have that, but you have to have that group that thinks beyond that as well.
Okay.
Yes.
First, a rhetorical question. How does Scheller stop becoming a secret force?
What's that?
How does Scheller College stop being a secret
yeah,
force?
well, I tell you, I'm doing everything to tell you the story, because it is one of the best kept secrets. Might even send some of my kids here, so
Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to be a secret. Anyway,
Yeah.
the question is what do you see as the home runs that have come out of Atlanta? And the reason why I ask that is somebody who's actually been in the entrepreneurial community doing Flashpoint and things like that has, when I said, well, how about ISS? And they would say, no, that was the difference between what the valuation would have been if it was in California versus here was like huge. So they say that they don't consider that a home run.
Right.
And so as I'm in these conversations, I'd like to know what the answer to these questions are about. Is that true about ISS?
Well,
And
I don't know, because the other part is if a dollar goes a lot further outside of the valley than it does here, and so it has pressure on profit. So everything becomes a hypothetical until it's not. And but there's timing too. I mean, there's also a very different time there in terms of valuations. For us, for our home runs, and I'm going to go back to the. Actually, you bring up a good point. Getting back to your question earlier. Atlanta has traditionally been, and still is to somewhat, very much a B2B city, which is not as sexy. Fast Company doesn't write about B2B companies, right? I mean, they love to get the celebrity from LA with the venture capital from San Francisco opening their business in New York. And it's kind of its own formula, Now I love Fast Company because they just did a great feature on Black entrepreneurism in Atlanta, and they actually are doing a good job discovering the kind of new Atlanta. But it's just B2B is not as sexy, so that's one of the issues where I think security, and with ISS did, is a real life example of something that's a pretty big deal. Or Pardot with David Cummings selling it, with Salesforce, that's a pretty big deal. It just doesn't get the headlines the way something does, and something we got to work on. Because B2B is pretty significant. If you look at Salesforce over in the Bay Area, and of course there's a big Salesforce building here in Buckhead, that's a B2B company. He showed you could make Salesforce, sexy. And he did everything that you had to do to do that over there. But if you really, really go back, I know this is going to seem like a stretch, but it's not. Coca-Cola was born here. The chicken sandwich was born here. But it's true to our DNA, and it's interesting part of these discussions we have. We kind of lose sight about our corporations, no different than anything else. We're really rooted in it. And now you start talking about how they reinvent themselves if they static, and this is why I love talking about Chick-fil-A. If you're talking about one of the most innovative companies in Atlanta, it is Chick-fil-A, by the way. So if you really, really wants to go to one of the most coolest, innovative environments, Chick-fil-A it is. And it's zero about food. I mean, they do have a food lab, believe me, but I mean, the part I'm talking about is zero to do with food. So that's I think the issue we got to go after, and frankly we're looking into, and we're convening some of the marketers from around the city to talk about this, is how do we tell the story? And to me it's going to become a lot about the people. MailChimp, Ben Chestnut, who I just had on screen, is going to be one of the big titans of entrepreneurism and tech. And we need to tell his story. We need to tell the story of some of our big corporate folks that are doing amazing things, whether it's a turn and all that. That's where the storytelling, I just mentioned, for an entrepreneur or innovator, you have to be a storyteller. We got to do that for our region as well, too.
Thanks.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to Terry's question, kind of related. In your bio, you mentioned disruptive innovation a few times, and I guess my question is sort of piggybacking on Terry's question. Are there any companies, not necessarily just entrepreneurial firms, but large corporate concerns that are doing disruptive things, or developing either business models or technologies that may have some disruptive impact on their industries in the future?
Yeah, there are. I mean, some obviously. This is one of the challenges when you talk about telling stories of corporations. They're also the best at keeping that close to the vest till it's time. So let me just go back to, I think I love using the term disruptive because it gets attention and it's real. But you also understand disruptive could have a different meaning for different people. And if you're a company that's a multi-billion-dollar, if you're a $10 billion a year company and you're growing at 5%, disruption could be getting to 6%. That's a lot of money on top of that revenue base, right? So I always like to put context, especially within big corporations, because when they talk about disruptive ideas, if you're Coke or GE or something, the pivot, it may not, it may be a big idea just to create 1% of growth, which people don't say is a big deal. That could be $100 million or $10 million of revenue, whatever the case might be. But there absolutely are big things happening in the corporations, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I mean, some of them, what's happening now with customer experience, I know seems so like, that's just table stake, but that's pretty significant. With the companies, the big corporations, what they could do that a startup can't is that they have a lot of resources they could throw pretty rapidly at some stuff. Sometimes it takes longer, but when it's time for them to deploy, it happens. So there absolutely is a lot of stuff happening around the city that I believe are disruptive, that some are being talked about, some are not. And you definitely see it around different corporations, around the world. And by the way, if you look about disruptive, Amazon is a big corporation now, and people don't think of them as a corporation, but they are. And look at what they do all the time. So it absolutely happens all the time. Some companies are not very good at it, and they're very comfortable in their model. And you could get into a whole discussion about their investment, their thesis with their investors and all that. But yeah, there's a lot of companies doing pretty big disruptive things. And sometimes it's also about brand, by the way. Sometimes it's not just about the stuff. Yeah.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. So kind of going off of that question, how would you say that the opportunity for corporate venture-based capital compares to just your traditional VC based opportunities both in Atlanta, so comparatively between the two in Atlanta, and then comparatively like the CVC opportunities available here versus elsewhere?
Yeah, so for corporate venture?
Yeah. Correct.
I'll tell you, I mentioned Engage Ventures before, and that's an example where roughly a dozen companies, so the big brands you could think about, Georgia Pacific, Chick-fil-A, Delta, all of them, Cox, invested in this venture fund to invest in startups. There's a lot of venture models around there. I think it's, and when you say opportunities, you mean for them to do well, or for someone to work for? Or both? Both, yeah.
Both. Or just for people to receive funding.
To receive funding.
VC
yeah,
versus
to receive
CVC.
funding, it could be, if you're in their lane, it could be pretty incredibly powerful. Engage Ventures is doing some pretty amazing things because they've gone an extra step from not just about the money, but they have somebody there. There's this gentleman named Daley Irvin, who's an incredible guy, one of the early employees of Airbnb, classic, very San Francisco guy, but loves Atlanta, by the way. Lives on the Beltline with his wife and now 2 kids. But what he does a really good job is marrying not just the capital, but then how can we make this startup better because of the relationship with the corporations. That's something that a lot of corporate aggregated corporate venture funds have not done before, and even sometimes captive venture funds have not done before, because it's kind of a business development thing. All the focus was just on the return. As we see more companies that like Engage Ventures thrive, they're like, we know that the returns will happen if we make those synergies occur. So I think that because of our corporate footprint, that some people say, oh, that makes us slow or whatever, actually that is an example of how to make it more dynamic.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think there's a lot of opportunity in the CVC space for Atlanta, especially being really prominent with the number of corporations we have right here in our city. So
yeah, and like anything else, some of the companies are in different phases of how they invest, and a lot of it has to do with their own innovation journey. The worst thing to do is have a corporation, start doing venture investing when they're not sure of their own innovation strategy, right? Because it kind of falls within the spectrum. Or there's some who get involved with startups just to learn. I mean, that's what Cox Enterprise is, another incredibly innovative company that people sometimes don't realize, but they have now 2 Techstars innovation hubs or accelerators here in Atlanta. One, by the way, solely focused on social impact, but that goes to show you the investment they're making to be part of that startup ecosystem, and they'll put money behind companies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Raise your hand. Oh, okay.
You're going to say you're moving to Atlanta now. You're going to stay in Atlanta. Go to chooseatl.com. We can help you.
Maybe. We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, all right. Very good.
Fair's not over yet, so we'll see. Who knows? So really, I just wanted to ask a question about you.
Sure.
For a lot of people who are passionate about products, specifically also that people use, not necessarily that are just there and that exist, they know that the customer experience, as you highlighted, is like one of the most crucial and important pieces. And one thing I noticed is that our customer experience has been very carefully curated by you prior to coming to this talk, how you wanted to deliver it, your level of casualness, how you dressed. Yeah. And so I really want to know, what was your aha moment that spiked that, customer experience is really important, and how has that sort of affected how you deliver your customer experience to everyone else who is experiencing your product?
Yeah, no, a great question. And so I think there's a few things. One is the whole topic of customer experience early on in my days at GE was something that I started exploring. I mentioned the names Beth Comstock, former CMO of GE, and folks said there's a time when they started going, hey, there's this thing called Net Promoter Score, and what's the experience? And I kind of got obsessed with it. And I go all the way back to when I was in college and I had an internship. I was working at a bank, and I had a bank that is now, I'm sure, part of one of the, one bank, 2 banks remaining. But I had a bank who they taught you simple things like, you always say we, not I, just little nuanced things to impact experience. And I feel like there was that art of that kind of got lost. And so when I kind of had a role, and I became one of the first customer experience leader at GE, and a B2B company, by the way, which is crazy. They're like, this doesn't make any sense. Companies don't have experiences, but companies are just a composition of people. That's when I became kind of obsessed with it. So that's one. Two is I find even though I have a finance degree, but I consider myself a marketer at heart, and I think authentic brands are focused on experience, no matter what. And three is it starts with authenticity. And so if you go to Disruptor, so if you do get a chance to watch Disruptor Studio, Ford Fry, who knows, who's ever heard of Ford Fry? I know he's not necessarily in a student budget for his restaurants, but he owns like Optimist and Beetle Cat and Superica and all those. But he is fascinating because to me he is the definition of a customer experience, because it is about that obsessive attention to detail. That ultimately you have to make this leap. Which who's studying? Any marketing majors in here? You'll get a few, and you get into brand, and you're going to learn in corporations. That's right. You're going to do fine. You're going to thrive. But when you find out about brand, there's always this tension. We talk about tension within businesses about how do you quantify stuff. But there's an element of brand and experience and customer experience that's non-quantifiable, and it's almost a belief in leap. Chick-fil-A is a great example. The My Pleasure thing was brute forced in by Truett Cathy for the operators to do it. I mean, he had to brute force that to occur, but that little phrase impacted the culture of the company. And so, I don't know, to me, it's just an obsession of it. To me, I think customer experience is the starting point of everything else when it comes to innovation and brand. MailChimp is another example. They organize, and Cabbage, another rising company, what's the experience we want the small business to have, which is a person? And then how do we innovate around that? And you're seeing people reinventing to that, this consumer-driven culture. So yeah, and by the way, the deliberacy, you have to want the deliberacy. So yeah, believe me, I work for a chamber, which I know, by the way, again, I never thought about it. I said, what the heck is a chamber? And what do we do? But I realized that people have this perception that, it's really formal and stuff, and I'm like, well, if we're going to talk about the next gen, I can't be in a suit all the time. Not to mention, I think I threw away all my suits a long time ago. But being deliberate is, I think, part of it. And you gotta, and that's that passion. This is, by the way, you gotta have diversity on your teams, because you gotta have someone on your team who's kind of that obsessed, customer obsessed, brand obsessed. And you also need to have someone on your team that's going to drive you crazy, because they're going to say this pragmatically doesn't make sense. And it could drive you crazy, but you need that tension to occur to get to the right result.
I'd like to ask a question.
Yep.
So I find this formula really interesting, and I'm kind of wondering what in your background made you decide that innovation was this area that you kind of wanted to pursue and study?
Probably my confusion tolerance, and is because and I think the biggest thing is that it's not really been defined. No one's really figured it out, and it really started with corporate innovation. There's some questions about corporations. Having lived within them for so much of my career and realized it's really hard, and there's some obvious stuff that I thought that I'm like, well, everybody's doing this, and I left corporate that I'm like, well, everybody's figured that out. Kind of like customer experience. I kind of assumed everybody's kind of figured it out. Then you realize there's these forces that are so big that doesn't let people figure it out. And so for me, it's like, you know what, it's this kind of this green field of opportunity to help define and help people on this journey of what it is. And by the way, you'll have other people talk about innovation, have a different perspective, maybe not a different perspective, but a parallel perspective. And that's fine too. I tend to come from this kind of human-based experiential perspective for innovation that focuses on collision and culture, and because on the people side of it. And so this is why when you notice on the innovation formula, all those elements come back to some element of human behavior at some point versus the process, because the process is just an empty process without the human behavior that goes with it. So I just, in my time in corporate, I would always spend a lot of time in terms of nurturing those experiences. Even for when I was running a business unit, we would go off site and we'd nurture very specific leadership retreats or events or stuff, thinking 9 months ahead of time. And for me, it was about how do I want these people to be thinking 9 months from now from where they are now. The stuff we do in between is important, but really the more important thing is what's the journey I take them on so they think more like this, so we could be able to move the company forward, because we're in an industry that, in this case, was a negative growth industry, and I got to figure out how to convince them to be more innovative. And so that's where this inspiration for this has come in terms of the formula around it, and then just as important, which we didn't talk as much today, the DNA of the people, because that's the hard part of it. You got to develop that, and some of you just have to have within.
anyone else want it before I ask? I wonder, is the chamber really focused on innovation, or are they focused on jobs? Or, because the extent to which they try to get companies to come seems to have so much more resources put into it. And I'm always questioning that because traffic sucks.
Yeah.
And K through 12 isn't great either. But I just wonder if my perception is almost right, and if it is, what it would take for them to shift a bit.
Well, I think we're focusing on thriving business climate. So that includes attracting jobs, having our current companies grow. There's a team, our economic development team at the Chamber, who they spend just as much time nurturing our existing companies, making sure they could thrive and grow, as they are recruiting companies. But to me, innovation is so if you think about the Chamber in terms of our just to kind of get into that piece of it, there's three things we do. We help grow the business climate, which is by attracting companies, attracting talent, and helping our companies be able to grow. We advocate for business favorable climate, which includes elements of policy and education and things of that sort, and then we promote. And there's some elements we got to promote more, some elements we promote, in terms of who we are. Innovation to me is a thread that goes all through that. Because whether you're BlackRock, who decided to come here just recently to open up their innovation center because they believe the talent and the culture and the environment is right for them, or whether you're Delta and we need them to continue to thrive. To me, a win is if Delta launches a new thing that generates a whole bunch of jobs and $100 million in revenue and they do well, that's great. Just like it is that if there's an entrepreneur who comes out of Atlanta Tech Village, Georgia Tech grad, and does what Paul, Judge does, that's a win as well too. So, so it's always tricky, particularly in a nonprofit, because there's not a number, but it's about the business climate. What I will tell you is we just literally celebrated, and I feel you're going to think I've been there forever. It's been 10 months, but we just celebrated our 160th anniversary, 160 of the Metro Atlanta Chamber. And it gave me a chance to kind of see the history. It's pretty impressive in terms of the things that it's gone all the way from, all the way to talk about Coke to, the Olympics to where it is now. And the big theme as we go into the next 160 years is about next gen. So for us, it's a recognition that, everything we've done necessarily wasn't perfect. Everything isn't perfect, but there's a lot of good foundations to grow upon. And getting conversations multi-generationally to understand what is the Atlanta we want, that's kind of where our head is at. Atlanta right now, by the way, is an area where I like to say it's like concrete that hasn't set. You have a chance to really shape what this region is like, because that's kind of where we're at. We're kind of like that teenager that's figuring out what do I want. That's where we're at. So it's a pretty cool time to help impact it and shape it.
So we have time for one more quick question. If anyone else has anything they want to ask.
It always kills the question right there.
What's your reaction to WeWork?
Wow. I mean, it's just wow. I mean, I think it goes back to you talk about tension, and again, this is as much as y'all know from reading what's going on in the press and all that, it's just tension within a company is just as important to help stimulate growth as also to make sure you govern growth, right? And look, I don't know everything around it, but I know when I was at GE, when I was there during the days of Jack Welch and of course Jeff Immelt, one of the things I've learned is always surround yourself by people that are smarter than you. And sometimes it can be frustrating because that means, because it creates tension in your own thinking. And I don't know if those are all the attributes with WeWork that kind of led to that. It also goes to show you how money could just follow inspired stories, and how did they believe that? But I would just say, wow, but we've seen this story before. We've seen some worse stories, with Theranos and a few other entities. It won't be the last time we see that. At the startup or scaling level, or nor at the corporate level. I mean, these things, happen, so this is why getting that leadership, the attributes, I think, for any company is super important. And for scaling companies, I have a lot of respect for these entrepreneurs who, as they scale, they start putting that structure around them. And sometimes you see some of these founders who remove themselves from the day-to-day, and some that don't, or reposition themselves, because that's important. That's important. So I just say wow, but without knowing all the details, of course. But hopefully, we have a lot of WeWork spaces here in Atlanta, so hopefully we'll be able to continue to grow those, obviously.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Let's give Alex one more big round of applause.
Thank you.